Good afternoon, good afternoon. Thank you so much for joining us here nationwide at 5. I'm Cliff Hughes.
Good afternoon, listeners. Good afternoon, Cliff. I'm Ricardo Brooks.
Good afternoon, Ricardo.
How are you?
Good. Well, as one of his final acts as president, Joe Biden pardoned Jamaica's first national hero, Marcus Garvey, who was convicted of mail fraud in the 1920s. Biden has set the presidential record for most individual pardons and commutations issued.
The former president announced on Friday that he was commuting the sentences of almost 2,500 people convicted of nonviolent drug offenses. As you'll hear in this report from Mahiri Stewart, Garvey's pardon has been decades in the making.
Marcus Mosiah Garvey was convicted in a U.S. federal court in 1923 of mail fraud. He was sentenced to 5 years imprisonment and was incarcerated for almost 3 years. It's widely considered by supporters of Garvey that he was convicted after being targeted by then-Director of the Federal Bureau of Investigations, FBI, J. Edgar Hoover, and deprived of a fair trial. Garvey's sentence was later commuted by President Calvin Coolidge on the recommendation of the U.S. Attorney General. Upon his release in November 1927, Garvey was deported via New Orleans to Jamaica. This despite millions of signatures petitioning for his full pardon. 9 of the 12 jurors who had convicted him also signed the petition. Over the years, several requests have been made for Garvey to be pardoned by the U.S. government. Former Prime Minister Edward Seaga made a request to former U.S. President Ronald Reagan when he visited Jamaica in 1982. That bid failed. The U.S. congressional campaign to clear Garvey's name was launched in 1987. That coincided with the 100th anniversary of his birth. At the time, New York Democrat Congressman Charles Rangel introduced legislation asking for Garvey to be exonerated. Rangel reintroduced his Garvey exoneration bill every year, telling members of the House in 2004 that the bill's passage was long overdue. At that time, he said, quote, "The injustice done to Garvey reminded me every day of the injustice done to all black people, including myself during that time." End quote. Former Prime Minister Portia Simpson Miller also championed the cause. In 2005, she instructed then Minister of Foreign Affairs and Foreign Trade, Senator Anthony Hilton, to have dialogue with Jamaicans in the diaspora and Congressman Rangel to fine-tune plans to approach the U.S. government to have Garvey's name cleared. That bid was rejected by the Obama administration in 2011. At that time, White House pardon attorney Ronald Rogers said the limited resources of the Justice Department would be better spent on other requests for presidential clemency. Prime Minister Simpson Miller made another attempt in 2015 during President Obama's historic visit to Jamaica. Simpson Miller told Obama it was, quote, "the deep desire of the government and the people of Jamaica," end quote, to have Garvey's record wiped clean. At the time, she said she asked the president to consider the matter and to offer any support within his authority during his tenure in the White House and beyond. Obama left office without doing so. Another effort was made in 2016 by Garvey's son, Dr. Julius Garvey, by way of an online petition. That bid was also unsuccessful. Later that year, the Jamaican government had the local criminal record of Garvey expunged. He was convicted in 1929 for contempt of court when he criticized Jamaica's legal system, which he referred to as oppressive. Since then, other bids have been made by members of the Congressional Black Caucus. Newly appointed chair of the caucus, Democrat Congresswoman Yvette Clarke, has led multiple calls for Garvey's exoneration. The last submission was made to President Biden in December. According to stakeholders, the fight now moves to Garvey's full exoneration. Mahiri Stewart for Nationwide at 5.
Thank you, Mahiri. And we're now being joined by the chair of the U.S. Congressional Black Caucus, the Congresswoman representing a district in Brooklyn, New York, Yvette Clarke, and President of the Universal Negro Improvement Association, Stephen Golding. Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen.
Good afternoon.
Good afternoon. It's great to be with you.
Good evening. Good afternoon. Well, let me begin with you, Congresswoman Clarke. Yes, the reactions where you are in New York to the news that President Biden has pardoned Mosiah Garvey, Marcus Mosiah.
Yes, I have a very large Caribbean American constituency here in Brooklyn, New York, and everyone has really been heartened by the posthumous pardon extended by former President Joe Biden. A number of folks see this as a step towards justice. There are others, like myself, who see this as a step, but recognize that we have further steps to take in exonerating the Honorable Marcus Garvey, with legislation being passed in the House of Representatives in the United States Congress.
Mm-hmm. And Congresswoman, why do you think it took so long? Because as we heard in that report, successive U.S. presidents have been asked to issue this pardon. Why did it take so long?
Well, I can't speak for other presidents, but what I can say is that we were fortunate and really blessed here in the United States to have Joe Biden as our president for the past 4 years. He had a deep commitment to justice, equity, and fairness, to really addressing a number of the wrongs in our criminal justice system that either provided the disproportionate sentencing of individuals from particularly Black and brown communities here in the United States to longer sentences for crimes that were committed writ large, but that others in society had far lesser sentencing for. He dealt with a number of the really egregious criminal justice matters. And us approaching him as a Congressional Black Caucus, along with many of the advocacy groups and organizations here in the United States, I think fell right within sort of his vision for righting those wrongs. And so we really owe a debt of gratitude to President Biden for seeing this as a moment where we could say, as the United States of America, that this is the beginning of an exoneration for the Right Honorable Marcus Mosiah Garvey, and that he recognizes the contributions that the Honorable Marcus Garvey made here in the United States.
Yeah, and if I could just follow up, Congresswoman, you talked about the next steps towards exoneration. You talked about a bill being introduced in the House of Representatives. Obviously, your Republican colleagues now control both houses of the Congress. You have a Republican president as at noon today. Are you hopeful that that step towards exoneration will move forward under Speaker Johnson?
Well, it has taken us this long to get to this point. We have to be vigilant. We have to persevere in the face of what may seem like an adversity. I am not going to relent now. I know that we have all of the wherewithal, all of the factual basis and information we need to hold a hearing, to do the things that need to be done to bring legislation to the floor of the House for a vote, likewise in the United States Senate. So, will this happen under a Speaker Johnson? It's not likely, but, I've gone through several speakers since my tenure here in the House of Representatives in Congress. And, we don't give up. We continue to do what is right. There's always a time to do what is right. And the goal is to not end our pursuit of justice until we receive it.
Yeah. Let me bring you in here, Stephen Golding. You told our listeners to the morning program today that this isn't the first presidential pardon granted to Garvey, and President Coolidge did so back in 1927. And you also said Garvey was the one who advocated for that pardon. Tell us a little bit more about that.
Yeah, absolutely, Cliff. Remember, and good evening to your listeners. Good evening, Congresswoman Clarke, and congratulations. The term for it is an executive grant of clemency. This is a presidential pardon. and Calvin Coolidge issued one in 1927, which commuted Garvey's sentence, immediate release with one caveat of immediate deportation. So, a pardon, it says we are, it's an unconditional pardon given for a crime committed against the United States government. So Garvey didn't receive parole, but he did receive a pardon in terms of not having to serve out the full 5 years of his sentence. So I'm glad the Congresswoman understands that the road doesn't end here, and that the path to an exoneration is not through the office of the President of the United States, but through the United States Congress. I think the victory in this can only be achieved if we use the awareness created by Biden's move to encourage the Congress and to motivate the Congress towards completing that exoneration. But it's a difficult path, and one that, Congressman Rangel in the 80s attempted to no success.
Yeah. And Congresswoman Clarke, the mobilization, yes, will that now taper off or intensify to push towards exoneration?
I believe it will intensify. We know that the Honorable Marcus Messiah Garvey was falsely convicted of a crime he did not commit. We know that the path forward must include congressional action to completely exonerate the Honorable Marcus Garvey. So I will continue to take all necessary action to clear his name, to deliver justice and closure for his descendants in particular, but all of us who recognize the value of his leadership and, quite frankly, addressing an injustice that took place over 100 years ago, but continues to reverberate throughout our criminal justice system here in the United States. We're focused, and we recognize that it may be a long road ahead, but this is not a sprint. This is a relay. And until we receive that justice, we will continue to introduce legislation, to press for hearings, and to go through the process that will yield ultimately his exoneration.
Stephen Golding, you also seem to have some of the granular evidence to indicate that Garvey was fraudulently prosecuted. If you will, tell us about that.
I'm glad you bring that up, Cliff, because since October of last year, we've been doing screenings of the first movie made on Marcus Garvey, the first narrative film. In fact, I am sitting in a vehicle with the writer and the lead actor who plays the role of Garvey, Samuel Lee Fudge. Now, we have just premiered it in Montego Bay on Saturday. That film, which is entitled Mosiah, and listeners can look at the trailer at mosiahthemovie.com, focuses specifically on Garvey's trial. And a lot of research was done and put into making it. And, part of the evidence that I spoke of earlier today, begins with the 1919 communication from J. Edgar Hoover, which, during the time of the Red Scare, as they called it in the United States, where Edgar Hoover was looking to lock up anybody affiliated with communism, any agitators or radicals. His eyes were set on a young Jamaican named Marcus Garvey, who had become, the voice of the people coming out of Harlem in New York City, particularly the Negro people of the world, as Garvey referred to them. And in that 1919 communication, Hoover says he has not yet committed any crimes, but we are looking for a reason to have him deported from the country, to get rid of him. That's 4 years before Garvey is charged with mail fraud. And at the time that Garvey was charged with mail fraud, it was himself and 4 other directors of the Black Star Line, right? It was 26 charges. At the end of the trial, they could only find one person guilty, being Marcus Garvey, and they could only convict him on one charge, right? 9 members of the jury refused to come back with a verdict, and they were prodded and coerced by the judge to come back with a guilty verdict against Garvey. We know this because when Garvey was incarcerated, they wrote to the United States President Calvin Coolidge at the time, each of them signing a petition for Garvey's sentence to be commuted and for him to be released. So there, law students can go over it. I know it's 100 years, so we can't expect a court to exonerate him, particularly because he has passed. And this is why it takes an action from the United States Congress, from the highest legislative body of the land. And I'm sure Congresswoman Clarke is well versed on this. She's familiar with that letter from J. Edgar Hoover. She's familiar with the situation of the case, the juror signing a petition for Garvey to be pardoned. We know this, and I just don't understand why it has taken so long. Marcus Garvey, as of yesterday, I think, becomes the third prominent black man to receive a posthumous pardon. And U.S. presidents were not even issuing posthumous pardons until Bill Clinton did so in 1999. The first one was issued to Lieutenant Henry Flipper, the first black man to graduate from West Point, the first black man to be appointed an officer in the U.S. Army when he was stationed with the Buffalo Soldier. And he was framed to make it seem as if he stole from the U.S. commissary and was given a dishonorable discharge. It took his family decades to try and clear his name. And even in the issuing of the pardon that Clinton says, it still says, we are pardoning you for crimes committed against the United States. And this is this real sticking point why people must realize that a pardon is not what we are seeking. It has to be an exoneration which admits to Garvey's innocence. It admits to the fact that Garvey was targeted and framed by the government. And in the case of any exoneration, such as the Central Park 5 a few years ago, in the case of any exoneration, the government will then have to be prepared to have discussions about reparations, or whether that includes compensation, and for whom or for what.
Congresswoman, before we run out of time, I just want to switch gears really quickly with you, because Donald Trump is now the 47th president of the United States. He has vowed that he will launch immigration crackdowns in what he calls sanctuary cities, New York, of course, being one of them. You represent a district with a large population of Caribbean American people. What's the mood there, and how are they preparing for these suspected raids?
Well, even prior to today's inauguration, our communities have been a flurry with activity. People are extremely concerned because they are in between status here in the United States. And though this administration has in the past indicated that they were going to be focused primarily on violent criminals, we know from previous experience in his prior tenure as president that that is not always so, that we cannot take him at his word. So a lot of the work that we have to do in our communities is really about people knowing their rights. We are encouraging certainly those who are in between status to stay within the boundaries of the law. And we're going to do everything we can to protect as many people as we can. But it is a time of a lot of trepidation here in the United States, not only in my constituency, but across the nation, for those who are undocumented, whose status is not hardened or confirmed yet within the United States citizenship and immigration services. So we've got a lot of work to do. Our office has always served as a place for those within our constituency or residing within the boundaries of our constituency that are seeking support and or assistance with their status to come and to receive accurate information. The one thing that we are encouraging is for folks who are in between status, who lack legal standing in the United States, to not be fooled by individuals out there that would use their plight to exploit them financially. So I encourage anyone who is listening to this program, who's watching this program, who may have family members abroad who are in between status to make sure that they check in with their Congress member in particular before they pay any fees to individuals out there who claim that they can adjust their status within the United States of America. This is a very troubling time in our nation. We have a very anti-immigrant administration that has come in to the White House. We also don't have a body, whether it's the Congress or the Supreme Court, that is welcoming to immigrants at this time. While we're in the minority, my party, which is the Democratic Party in the House of Representatives, the Republican Party, which espouses many of the same values that you hear articulated by President Trump, control sort of the levers of power in our legislative body as well as in our courts. So this is indeed a very challenging time for immigrants in the United States, and I anticipate it becoming even more difficult as the days go by.
Thank you very much, Congresswoman Clarke and President of the UNIA, Stephen Golding. That's all the time we have this afternoon. Thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen.
Appreciate your time. Thank you.